I'm going to introduce our wonderful moderator for today. I'm very happy to introduce Michael Douglas, the civil litigation attorney with Parker Shafi Law Firm in downtown LA. And over the past 30 years, Mike has represented corporate and individual clients in lawsuits and litigated numerous cases before California judges and juries, argued before the California Court of Appeal. And Mike has served as a dedicated board member on the Sentinel Youth Services Board of Directors since 2019. And I am going to turn it over at this point to our panel. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for the nice introduction. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this, hearing from our speakers as we discuss this really important restorative justice tool. And I guess I'll start by introducing our guest speakers, and I will start with Dr. Shalonda Sunshine Crawford. Welcome, Dr. Crawford. With an impressive background boasting 6 professional degrees, Dr. Sunshine, as she's known, is a licensed psychologist renowned for her ability to explore deep-seated issues and identify silver linings for her clients, patients, and listeners. As the host of the Dr. Sunshine Show on Tavis Smiley's KBLA Talk 1580 AM, she engages in therapeutic conversations with the world, addressing mental health stereotypes, negative impacts, and stigma within the Black community. Dr. Sunshine is a sought-after speaker, so we're happy to have her at national events, conferences, workshops, and expert panels. And during our webinar this evening, she's going to share her expertise on the psychological and emotional benefits of writing apology letters. Our other panelist is Kimberly Polanco. Welcome, Kimberly. Kimberly has been a mediation case manager with Sentinel Youth Services for the past year. In her role, she does outreach to families, onboards them into the various CYS programs, and on occasion, she actually steps in and mediates disputes as part of her work. Kimberly typically has direct contact with families, and she's one of the people who helps guide them through the mediation process. Prior to joining CYS, Kimberly was an intern for Riverside County in the Foster Youth Coordinating Program Department. And in that role, she worked directly with foster youth counselors in the school district. Kimberly has also volunteered work for the Youth Justice Coalition, and in that role, she learned more about the advocacy work that the coalition does in the minority communities. So we'll hear more from Dr. Sunshine and Kimberly in just a moment. But first, I wanted to tell you all that this is the 4th webinar in CYS's 4-part series on restorative justice. Just to recap, the first 3, for those folks who weren't able to attend, the first session was called Safer Communities Through Restorative Justice. And in that webinar, we went over exactly what restorative justice is and how the very punitive justice system erodes accountability, and also things like what is really at the root of violence, and importantly, how restorative justice actually helps our brain and how we treat other people. The second webinar was called Healing Through Conflict, and there we went over how we can find peace and sometimes even growth in moments of conflict or tension. And our third webinar was titled Stronger Schools Through Restorative Justice. And there we went over how and why our schools are actually moving away from zero tolerance policies and school policing and other punitive practices, and instead moving towards trauma-informed restorative practices based in support and healing. Now, with all of that really great information under our belt, we are rounding out our webinar series with this final webinar, which is focused on a real-life restorative justice practice, apology letter writing. And just to provide an overview of apologies and how they fit into the restorative justice model, restorative justice practices implement apology letters as a chance for any involved party to basically express how they're feeling. And these apologies can come in different forms. They can be delivered in person, they can be emailed, they can be typed out and printed, etc. They're typically offered to partners or coworkers or neighbors or family members, etc. And they're typically offered because a person simply wants to admit that they made a mistake, or that they feel badly about how they treated somebody. Now, with that overview in mind, let's welcome Kimberly to the conversation and get some more details about apology letters and how they actually factor into the restorative justice model. Thank you for joining us, Kimberly.
Thank you, Mike.
So, you are actually in the trenches every day doing this important work, and you use apology letters as a tool in your work. So, can you tell us exactly what is an apology letter and what kind of apology letters do you actually see in your practice?
Yes, so an apology letter is a writing that someone can write to someone that has been harmed by their actions to express remorse. It could be to ask for forgiveness and to really share their deeper understanding of how their actions have affected that person. Oftentimes, I see apology letters being written to the victim, or as we like to call the harm party. The purpose of that is for the youth specifically to share their remorse, to really explain their deeper thoughts of what they have done, to share anything new that they may have learned from the incident all the way into a mediation, because during mediation they are given more insights about how their actions has a bigger effect than the ones they may think it actually has. Another type of apology letter that I usually see is to parents. During mediations, the parents are there as well. They have an opportunity to share how the incident has also affected them, and not just them, but the relationship with the youth. So the youth writing a letter to their parents is really, really helpful to mend their relationship, and for the parents to, maybe not take the toll on themselves, because that happens. Parents sometimes feel like whatever their child has done may have been a failure on their end. So it's really, really useful for their relationship, especially for the home environment, for the parents to feel more relieved and more understood.
And now, Kimberly, can you give us some more details about suggestions in writing apology letters?
Yeah, of course. And so actually, if we could have the apology letter suggestions, so I can go ahead and go over it. Perfect. Thank you. So again, an apology letter does not have to be like this, but these are really, really good suggestions to make an apology letter more insightful versus just maybe like a one sentence simply stating, I apologize for doing X, Y, and Z. So I will go ahead and just share out a few questions that I feel are really, really good to include in an apology letter. So give me a second. Apologize for my dogs. So a great question would be, how do you think your actions affected the injured party? If this behavior continues, how will this affect your life in the future? What could happen to you? Do you want that? Explain why or why not. So that's a great point for the youth to reflect on what they have done, how it could have affected them negatively in the future, but also for them to share that with the recipient of the letter, for the recipient to get a better understanding of who they are, to sort of feel more empathy towards them and build that connection with each other, and to really get closure at the end of the day. Another great question would be, what could you have done differently? I think that's a really, really good question. Although the youth may not be able to go back in time and change what they have done, it's a great question to think about, because in the future, they could be like, hey, maybe I should do this. I've experienced this before, and this is what I should do this time. So it's a great thing to reflect on for the future.
And can you tell us, let's talk about you know, the actual work that you're doing with the youths and getting them to write these letters. Do you find that, how do they receive this process? Is it difficult to get the youths to engage, or do you find that they're receptive to it?
I would say most of the time the youth are receptive. I feel sometimes the youth maybe are a bit, just nervous and feel really anxious because, they know they did something wrong and they're scared of what could happen in the future once, they've been caught for the mistake. So I think when they come into these mediations, they're really just nervous, but once they have a conversation and they're really able to open up about how they feel and reflect and to say like, I apologize, and for that to be understood, I think they really appreciate that and they really become welcoming to the whole process and really welcoming to writing these apology letters because they want to share this newfound information that they've received.
Yeah, it's interesting, when you talk about the different recipients of these letters, parents versus individuals who may have been harmed through some conduct of the youth. And I think you kind of touched on it. Is there a difference in how the particular youth deals with the apology letter process depending on the recipient of the letter? And then what do you see from the recipients in these different circumstances?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing when it comes to writing an apology letter to the harmed party is they really, really want to share their remorse and they really want to make it known that they've learned from this experience. Those are the main points that they want to share with them because, sometimes, being a harmed party, it can be a difficult emotion for them as well to be open to the youth who may have done something to them, but the youth having the opportunity, I feel like it really just calms them down and makes them feel like they're being given a second chance to make up for what they have done. When it comes to parents, I think again it just really, really helps with their relationship because sometimes it's really, really hard, it's really emotional, and the youth to say that to their parent, in everyday conversation, I'm sure they discuss and say like, I'm sorry for doing that. But having it in a writing and fully reading it out and taking it in, I feel it makes it much more thoughtful. And to have it there, to go back and read it is really meaningful.
So what you're describing is situations where the youth actually sometimes where the youth is actually reading the apology
Yeah.
letter to their parents or to the harmed party. I would assume you've seen situations where that can be pretty emotional.
Yes, yes, I definitely recall one with a youth who took the incident very, very hard on themselves. They felt really bad for the incident. They felt like, it was the end of the world, the end of the relationship with their parents. So reading that over to the parent and the parent, letting them know like I love you. I'm here to support you. You will always be my child. I will always be your parent. And a mistake happened, but we don't ever want you to feel that, this is the end of it. You've learned and we see that and we value that.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I understand that you have a sample apology letter to share.
Yes, I do. Alrighty, thank you. So this is the letter I will be reading, and it is for you guys to follow along. In case maybe I'll try to go slow so everyone can hear what I'm saying. So this apology letter reads, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I am writing to sincerely apologize for my recent actions that have deeply troubled me and caused harm to your store. I shoplifted bikinis from your store location, which was an excusable act that I deeply regret. I understand that my actions were not only illegal but also unethical, and I am truly sorry for the distress and loss I have caused. There is no justification for my behavior, and I acknowledge the consequences of my actions, both for your business and the larger community. I want to assure you that this incident is entirely out of my character for me, and I take full responsibility for my actions. I understand the importance of ethics, respect for others, and the value of honesty, and my actions were a clear departure from these principles. Moreover, I would like to apologize not only to the person, but also the employees who may have been affected by my actions, as well as the customers who may have been inconvenienced. I am committed to learning from this experience and making sure that I never engage in such behavior again. I understand that my apology cannot undo the past, but I hope it can serve as a first step toward making things right. I appreciate your understanding and your dedication to the principles of fairness and justice. I will do my best to rectify my actions and make amends for the harm I have caused. So that is an apology letter that a youth wrote to a harmed party. And I want to go ahead and just depict a few of the sentences that were written and go over them with you guys. So one of the main things I want to highlight is I understand the importance of ethics, respect for others, and the value of honesty, and my actions were a clear departure from these principles. This is the youth really showing deep thought of, what they have done, reflecting on how whatever action they took was against who they are as a person, and it went against who they are, who they want to be, and what they want to represent. And that's really, really insightful, especially for someone young to have learned that just from mediation, from getting more insight about how their actions may have affected someone else. Another point I would like to highlight is I am committed to learning from this experience and making sure that I never engage in such behavior again. The youth has shared with her her values of who she really is and what she wants to represent, and she's just restating that she has learned. She will never do this again, and it also shows that you can learn from your mistakes. They're a wonderful thing that you can learn from, makes you a better person, gives you real life experience for future situations as well. And I do want to note that, this is a teenager who committed a mistake, just like many of us have committed mistakes when we were younger, but it doesn't define who you are or who you will be in the future. And I think this youth has really captured all of that in their letter.
Oh, that's great. And now just in terms of like the process of this,
Yeah.
so this is a letter that was read aloud at a mediation?
So this is given after the mediation. They're able to go ahead and write it on their own time and then turn it in once they've really had the chance to make it thought out. Not in the moment pressured, but to really have that time to think and reflect. By themselves.
That's great. I'm going to bring Dr. Sunshine into the discussion here. Um, and thank you for that, Kimberly, because Dr. Sunshine, now that we know what apology letters are and how they're used, I'd like to talk about like why they're important and beneficial. So thank you for joining us today. Listening to Kimberly and given what's in these letters, it sounds like these apology letters, the apology letter process is actually quite cathartic in a lot of ways. And I know modern medicine tells us, as you know, better than all of us, that stress and conflict can play a role in damaging our emotional health as well as our physical health. And so I'm curious, can you tell us a bit more about maybe the physical benefits of this apology letter writing process? For example, can you equate good relationships and cathartic activities like this with contributing to good physical health?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, thank you so much for having me as a part of this panel to share and to participate in what I think is an important topic, probably not talked about enough in our community and culture. So I do want to begin by saying that. Um, yes, apologies are definitely good for improving relationships, which in turn has a great effect on our physical health. So first and foremost, apologies, it's the first step. It's like the gateway into particularly for youth, a boost in confidence and dignity and self image, just the ability to stand and say, hey, I'm sorry. It resolves conflicts. So when you are in the position to resolve conflicts, automatically you are in a position to reconcile, restore, rebuild relationships. And if you're a person with consciousness, which a person writing an apology letter has some level of consciousness about the wrongdoing on their part, you're not carrying around the stress of the incident. The repair helps to reduce the stress of the incident. And we all know what the effect of stress can have on our psyche, on our physical bodies, on our mental and emotional well-being. So, many, many benefits to decreasing stress and high blood pressure, boosting immunity. So, yeah, all the way around, there are advantages to building and repairing relationships, reconciling relationships, and also on physical aspects when you decrease the stress attached to the offending incident.
Listening to, the letter that Kimberly was writing, I mean, yeah, obviously it's written in the voice of a teen, but I was hearing some really high level, self-reflection and accountability. And I wanted to tie that into what you just said about being able to resolve conflicts. It sounds like this process actually gives them a leg up on, not just mending this particular fence, but in learning how to accept responsibility and use that later in adult years to avoid other kinds of conflicts.
Yeah, certainly. Wonderful point and observation. I thought as the letter was being written, wow, what an insightful young person. How many lessons can adults take from this young person who is digging inside themselves? And it's obvious, the growth is obvious and apparent, and definitely something that adult people, teen people, we should definitely take notes and put some of those same principles to action and at work for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I know that we can see that there are lots of benefits to the writer in writing these apology letters, but can you tell us from a psychologist standpoint, how is it helpful to the person that's receiving this letter? What kind of benefits do they get? And maybe you could even differentiate between, for example, to use the examples that Kimberly was talking about, parents receiving an apology letter versus maybe harmed individuals who are receiving these letters.
So I think for the person receiving the letter, well, let me begin here. For both the writer and for the receiver of the letter, it is the first step in making it right. So it's asking, how can I repair this? And when you're receiving the letter, for once, you have a bit of not control, but influence on the way that we approach, resolve, and repair. You get a chance to be heard and contribute to your own healing journey. So it's powerful on both ends. Again, the biggest thing is the opportunity for repair. So if I'm receiving the letter, whether I want to restore a relationship with the person or not, I'm given an opportunity to go deeper in my own healing. This person is saying, let me partner with you on your healing journey. And for a lot of people, we get, as human people, when we're not heard, we get caught up and stuck right there. They did me wrong. I'm healing. I have perhaps forgiven them, but there's something magical in a person admitting the wrongdoing and saying, I'm sorry. I do have remorse and regret. To the point of the letter, I would do things differently if I can. So as a recipient, it's an opportunity to be seen, heard, acknowledged, and to go deeper into healing. Not as a receiver, rather.
It's interesting that, I recently had something in one of my cases where this came up. It was handling a very contentious, landlord-tenant dispute. And the case went on for years, and we got right before trial. We could not resolve the case. And ultimately, and it's a little unconventional to do this, but I had my client talk to the CFO of the other party. So the two principals, no lawyers, just these two individuals were talking. And lawyers never let that happen. But it was a very unique circumstance. So we did it. And what was really interesting was that CFO said to my client, I'm really sorry that this got this far. I'm sorry things got this far. I wish we could have resolved this before a lawsuit. You know, the CFO is obviously up here. He's got all those people down here making those decisions. And he said, "I'm really sorry. We really respect you, and we enjoyed having you as a, you know, as a business partner, and we want to get past this." And it was that the thing that stuck out for my client was he said he was sorry. That apology was all we needed to break the logjam. And it's exactly what you said. We got the CFO even in acknowledging that. It completely changed their position. They became much more reasonable on settlement terms. My client became much more reasonable in what he was able to hear and accept. And so we resolved that case within 2 weeks of that conversation. It was just a matter of the lawyers shuffling papers. But it was a real life example of the power of an apology. I don't know that people really understand what a powerful tool it can be, not just in restorative justice, but just generally.
Yeah, you know what I heard in listening to you spell out that particular case? What I heard was sitting down and taking the time to for one person to hear out the other person. It allowed ultimately for the person who was offended to hear the offender and to separate the offense from the actual character of person. It's like, you know what, now that I've had a moment to hear you out and to embrace your thoughts and feelings and remorse, it's a big thing. Now I can separate you from the offense, and now we can, you know, move towards the reconciliation. That's the beauty and power. That's the gift of an apology. It's a perfect example of that.
So if they're so helpful and they're so beneficial, why in our culture are apologies so rarely used or talked about? What is this aversion that people have to saying I'm sorry and taking accountability in writing or just verbally?
Okay, so that is such, it's a simple question, but I think as the more I think about it, the more I feel like it's a layered and almost convoluted answer. And I think there are so many pathways and approaches to it, approaches to an answer. But let me begin here. Psychologically speaking, culturally, admitting wrong, first of all, is emotionally and psychologically uncomfortable. It's almost painful to self. And part of it is what I referred to earlier. Part of it, if I admit that I'm wrong, then my actions speak to the character of me. So if I did that wrong, a part of me is admitting that I myself am wrong. Bad people do bad things. So sometimes it's hard to admit because we ourselves have a difficult time separating the action from the person that we are. I often say there's a difference between doing and being, and it's not talked about enough. I failed a test repeatedly, but I am not a failure. So what I did doesn't dictate the person that I am. And that is difficult. Also, you know, if I admit that I did this wrong, will it open the floodgates to more highlighting and spotlighting on other things I've done wrong? And this is more so not in the case of one-offs like the letter where the teen took a bikini from a store, but what about if the offense is against parents? So I'm going to admit that I did this wrong, but will my parents, you know, travel me down the rabbit hole, and now we got to unpack and, you know, drudge up all of this. So, you know, there's kind of a fear that the apology may open a floodgate and be more conflictual than or opposite of what I'm setting out to do, you know, right now and in this moment. And then I think, you know, last but not least, there is for a lot of people an enormous amount of shame that is attached to, wrongdoing. And so again, I guess it ties back to the initial. I feel shame about what I've done. And that is just another way of saying I'm attaching the act to the person that I am. So can I be seen beyond this act? It's very difficult to do in our community because we don't. I think we should have more conversations like this one so that we can have safe places to do it.
Yeah, I'm curious about, in your experience, because it sounds like what you're describing is, for a teen writing an apology letter, there's a certain vulnerability that goes along with doing that. You're opening up, you're, really holding yourself out there accountable. And then particularly when you're dealing with a parent who has their own feelings, you don't know what's going to come back. And so what I hear is, on the one hand, this teen has to be vulnerable enough and accountable enough to write this letter, but at the same time, have the strength to be able to accept what comes back, the raw feelings that come back, which may not necessarily be what teen wants to hear.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about your thoughts about that. And then I'm also curious about, as we talk about apology letters more broadly in our community, do you think it's more difficult for a teen to deal with that vulnerability issue, or a person who's a little older in our community, and who now you've gotten all these other things, these accolades, these titles, this pride, you're older, you're wise. Is it more difficult for a teen going through the process that Kimberly's talking about, or an adult just using some, just a basic apology in their everyday life? So I'm just curious about those two things.
I think it depends. And I think, and it depends on variables that are at play. Some teens are, well, in general, I'm gonna go back. So in general, teens are either in the identification stages where they're coming into who they are, and then that whole, convoluted kind of processing, who am I, is this me? So some of those things can be at question and in play. But when I reflect on the letter that was read, that teen seems to be very much in touch with self. So that incident doesn't define who I am. That teen said, what I did is totally in disalignment with the principles that I govern myself by. So that person, is pretty well individualized and has a good foundation about who they are internally. Now, when we have teens that don't have the ability to do that, they grow up and become adults without that ability to do that. So it kind of depends on our experiences. It depends on our worldview. And I'm going to go back to the cultural, systemic effects of not having safe spaces and not being able to normalize an apology as an acceptable, okay thing that doesn't define who you are.
It sounds like it's important for the teen to draw a distinction between what they did and who they are. It's not, I'm a horrible person and I'm sorry. No, I made a mistake and I'm sorry about that. But it's important for them to understand that you're a great person who made a mistake, a small one or a big one.
100%. That is the message for both adults and children. You made a mistake. There's a difference between what you do and the essence of who you are. We all make mistakes. No, not one can get away without making a mistake. It's almost a part of the life experience. It actually is a part of the life experience. It's something that we all have in common. But I love to tell people mistakes only remain mistakes when we don't draw the lesson. So if parents can say, okay, you did that. I'm not happy about that. There's a consequence that comes with that. Now tell me, what can you draw from that to be different and better moving forward? Let's draw from it. Let's grow. Let's strengthen from the incident. Can we normalize that? Can you imagine us just being stronger in general if we can turn mistakes into lessons? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure it's very healthy of me to say, oh, I never make mistakes. So I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know about that, doctor. But I'm sure other people that make mistakes. No, of course, I've made plenty
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
over my years. So it's an interesting dynamic. Now from the parent's perspective, receiving these things, and I guess you have to have a parent, where it's a child and a parent. You want to have a parent who's also invested in this process and also emotionally mature enough to be able to accept that apology letter in a productive way with the idea of moving forward as opposed to piling on and sort of making things worse. You need a good receiver um, and a good offerer.
Yeah, well, I say, accepting an apology, forgiving, and making efforts to move forward, obviously it can be challenging. Most of us have had that challenge in front of us. But I'd say, particularly to parents, begin with empathy. Begin with empathy. And because we all have mistakes as a part of our personal experience, maybe we can begin by recalling when we needed the grace and understanding that our children are now in need of. Maybe we can extend understanding in the way that we needed understanding. Maybe we can teach and lead in the way that we needed teaching and leading when we were younger. You know what I mean? So if we find that to be a difficult task or a challenge in front of us, a good way to begin is by employing and putting to work the practice of empathy.
Empathy, it sounds like empathy is a critical part of this process
For sure.
for both parties.
Yeah.
You have to understand each person's perspective to
Yeah.
really sort of be an effective component in this healing process.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important.
I mean, I'll start with myself. I when I think about, for me, the times in my life that I needed a second chance or a pass, I know that I wouldn't be who I am today without, a 220-second pass. It sometimes it pays off. So yeah, I'm always looking for opportunities to pay it forward, for sure.
So in your practice, I guess these um, apology letters are it's a sort of a one shot tool. It's very important, but I guess these, especially with parents and children, these issues aren't resolved overnight necessarily. Um, but these apology letters, it's a step in the right direction. What would you expect to see after that? What's the process that you think will be most productive once you've opened the door with this apology letter in terms of parent and child going forward after that process has begun? Is it
So
like
parent
formal
and child.
counseling? What kinds of things do you think they should be employing?
So I think it definitely depends. Obviously, these things are so varied, but it obviously depends on what it was and what the circumstances were, what the relationship is between parent, and child. Because in many instances, you have to work on repair, in the area of trust, and it could mean a deep dive into getting to know who each other, who we are, individually and collectively as parent, and child. But I would recommend, for a parent to being open to hearing your child out in a way where you can provide and be a guiding force. But no one speaks up, admits any of that in a space that is not safe. And what do I mean by safe? In a space where I'll be judged, found guilty, made to feel shame. And so the space has to be safe in that I can admit wrongdoing, but I'm getting critical feedback and not condemnation. So, and that if I'm a parent and I want a better relationship, I need to open it up for vulnerability. Vulnerability then leads to closeness, and closeness is intimacy. So I do want a close and intimate relationship with my child or parent, and I can only accomplish that if I'm able to be my true and authentic self without judgment, without the fear of judgment.
You know, we have a question from the audience, a good question here. How can we ensure the safe space?
Well, I think this. I don't know. I don't know if we can ensure in the moment. I think the safe space happens over time. It has to be proven. Trust is built over time and not with one specific or particular incident. You know what I mean? Time and action. Like, can you back up what you're saying? If you've offended me, I'm already a little hesitant. It's going to take some time and some mutual exchange in order for us to build that up. And it takes transparency. You build safety by continually putting yourself out there and taking that risk. And if you are the recipient of the offense, you too have to kind of take a risk. Do I try this again? I'll give you a little, not a lot, so that's the reason why time is the key there, because I need time to slowly get a little.
All right, we've got another question from the audience. This one's a little longer. There's some background here. But she says, I too coordinated a diversion program in San Francisco where youth that participate engage in conferencing. When charges are not dropped and the youth volunteers to engage in circle process, they do tend to be more understanding of an apology letter. Yet I feel as though they better understand accountability versus apology. Any tips or recommendations?
So just so that I understand, is the question asking why is accountability more important than apology?
Yeah, I think that is one of the questions that comes from this question. So maybe we can address that question.
Uh-huh. Well, I think they're equally important. It's one thing to admit, because accountability is basically taking ownership of what you've done. So that helps. I want you to take ownership of what you've done, but part of taking responsibility for what you've done, and telling me that I know you admit that you've done this, but you do have some remorse, some regret about it. You are taking me and how this has affected me into consideration. That's where an apology comes into play. It's one thing to say, hey, okay, I admit I did it. That's great. I know you did. But now I need the extra step to say, I regret what has happened as a result of my decision or action. And I
Is
hope
that
I'm
more
answering the question.
is that more important, that the actual regret? Is that more important for the person that's hearing it or for the person that's saying it?
I think it's important for both if it's genuine. If it's genuine, then it helps to relieve some of the inner battle of the person who has committed the offense. There's a sense of settlement. There's power. There's magic in reconciliation. you have had an opportunity to express yourself and be heard. You have had an opportunity to be seen beyond the act. And that's a two-way give and take. So I think it is as important for the offender as it is for the person who has been offended.
We have another question, and this is a really good question. From the offender's perspective, can you speak to the challenge of how to accept that we may need to apologize for the impact of our actions when we feel strongly that our intentions were good?
Their intentions. So let me make sure I get this. My intention was good, though it was offensive to you.
Yeah, and I'll read again. Can you speak to the challenge of how to accept that we may need to apologize for the impact of our actions when we feel strongly that our intentions were good?
So you had well intentions, your intentions were good when you did it, but you learned that you have offended someone. Again, that requires you to step outside of yourself and into the shoes of the recipient to fathom the impact, no matter the intention. Because for me, I know there have been many times when I have felt offended. And then when I sit down and talk to the person, I do realize that your intention was not to offend me. But the power of an apology is that it opens up the conversation. And now we get to communicate about it. So when I learn where your motivation was, where your intention, where your heart was at the time, it doesn't mean that it cures me of the pain, but it does have an effect on how I now see this, how the impact can be lessened, decreased when I realize you didn't mean to do that. It's one thing to walk by me and bump me and knock my coffee over. It's another thing when you intentionally knock me and I'm gonna experience that different. I'm gonna ingest that differently, and it makes a difference. So yeah, I think for the person who has unintentionally hurt someone, it's even more important for you to express your intention, the underlying intention. And in politics, I did not mean to hurt you. I'm very sorry that I did. Now, here's what doesn't work. That whole, well, I'm sorry if I offended you, because that's not, no.
The whole classic.
The classic, well, I'm telling you that you did. So can you stop, take a minute and empathize? Join me here. It wasn't your intention, but do you have a feeling about the fact that it did hurt me, even though you didn't mean it? That lessens the impact of the pain.
Yeah, you can, it goes back to the point you made earlier about empathy. Once I know what your true intentions were, I can better understand, where you were coming from. And it doesn't lessen, it doesn't necessarily lessen or doesn't invalidate my reaction to it.
Exactly. It's not the cure, but it helps.
Yeah, it's at least I know there's a difference of, like the coffee. I'm a lot less upset if you knock my coffee over by accident than if you did it intentionally.
Yes. As a matter of fact, I may, as I'm wiping it off and you want to help, no, I don't need your help. But if it's an accident, oh, thank you. It just changes the whole texture, the whole light of it all. The intention matters. Motivation matters a lot.
Motivation matters. That's an important point to take away from this. So do we have any other questions from the audience? All right, it looks like I don't see any other questions. And it looks like we're getting close to the end of our time here. And so I would like to say thank you very much, Dr. Sunshine, for your comments. We really appreciate that. And Kimberly, thank you for your your real life experiences in the, in the trenches doing this important work. Um, as we come to the end of the seminar here or the webinar, I'd like to say that I think there was a question earlier. CYS will send out to all the registrants the suggestions to write an apology letter that we talked about earlier. And hopefully registrants should be able to use that in your own lives and in your work. And Nat will share the CYS info in the chat. You'll have access to our Instagram, email, website, newsletter, volunteer link, and always important, the link to donate. That will also be in the chat. And of course, if there are any other questions after today, you can email CYS at info@cys-la.org. And you can always follow what CYS is up to. You'll see a lot of our executive director, Jessica, on there on our Instagram page, CYS_LA. You will also receive a follow-up email from CYS that will include the suggestions to write an apology letter. And someone asked about this, links to all of the 4 recordings for the 4 webinars. So with that said, thank you very much for spending this hour with us. Thank you, Dr. Sunshine, for your time. Thank you, Kimberly, for your time and your work. And with that, I'll say goodbye and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks everyone for coming. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.